Every morning, their garden held freshly dug holes. The truth was even stranger. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the sprawling garden behind Ellie Whitaker's Victorian home. It was early October, and the air carried a crispness that hinted at winter's approach. The leaves on the old oak tree by the fence had begun their annual transformation. Burnt orange and deep amber scattered across the lawn like confetti from nature's farewell party. For decades, this garden had been Ellie's sanctuary, a place where she could escape life's chaos and find solace in the rhythm of planting, nurturing, and harvesting. Ellie knelt beside a row of marigolds, her hands caked with rich soil as she inspected each bloom for signs of pests or disease. She wore an oversized cardigan against the morning chill, its soft wool worn thin from years of use. Her husband Arthur used to joke that she treated her plants better than him, but there was no bitterness in his teasing, only affection. Now, 4 years after his passing, the garden served as both her joy and her tether to memories of happier times. After finishing her rounds, Ellie stood up, brushing dirt off her knees, and surveyed her handiwork. But something caught her eye, a disruption in the otherwise pristine symmetry of her flower beds. 3 perfectly round holes, shallow yet deliberate, marred the earth near the rose bushes. Each hole was about the size of a dinner plate, spaced evenly apart, as though someone or something had carefully measured before digging them. Frowning, Ellie stepped closer, crouching down to examine the oddity. The edges were smooth, not clawed or uneven like they might have been if raccoons or squirrels were responsible. Whatever made these wasn't acting out of instinct. It seemed purposeful. Still, Ellie shook her head, dismissing the strange sight as animal mischief, or perhaps neighborhood kids playing pranks. Yet a nagging unease lingered at the back of her mind, whispering that something didn't feel quite right. Later that afternoon, Harold came ambling through the side gate, his gait slow but steady. He was Ellie's neighbor of 30 years, a retired mechanic with perpetually grease-stained fingers and a heart as kind as they came. His graying hair stuck out in all directions, and his flannel shirt looked like it hadn't seen an iron in months. "What's got you scowling?" Harold asked, nodding toward the garden. His voice was gruff but warm, carrying the faint trace of a Boston accent he'd never managed to shake. Ellie gestured toward the holes. "This showed up overnight. Animals, maybe? Or kids messing around?" Harold squinted at the ground, then scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Could be raccoons," he muttered, though his tone betrayed his skepticism. "Or, I don't know, looks too neat for critters." She nodded, appreciating his honesty, even if it did little to ease her discomfort. "I know what you mean. Something feels off." He glanced at her sideways, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay, Ellie? You seem unsettled." "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But Harold didn't look convinced. He lingered for a moment longer, shifting awkwardly, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he gave her shoulder a reassuring pat. "Let me know if anything else crops up, and don't worry too much. It's probably nothing." As Harold shuffled away, Ellie watched him go, grateful for his presence but still unable to shake the feeling that something peculiar was unfolding. The garden had always been predictable, reliable. This intrusion felt wrong, like an unwelcome guest showing up unannounced. That evening, as twilight settled over the house, Ellie sat in her favorite armchair by the window, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, sending a few stray leaves spiraling to the ground. She sipped tea, trying to focus on the rhythmic motion of her stitches, when the phone rang. Startled, she set her project aside and reached for the receiver. "Hello? Hi, Mom." Lila's voice crackled through the line, cheerful but tinged with nervous energy. "How are you doing?" Ellie smiled despite herself. Lila lived 3 states away, busy with her career as a graphic designer and raising 2 rambunctious boys. Calls weren't uncommon, but they usually followed a predictable schedule. This one felt different. "I'm good, sweetheart. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make Ellie's stomach tighten. "Actually, I wanted to let you know, I'm coming to visit soon. Next weekend, if that works for you." Ellie blinked, caught off guard. "Of course it does. I'd love to see you. But why so suddenly? Lila hesitated again, and Ellie's unease returned, sharper this time. It's nothing bad, Mom. Really, I just need a break. Some time away from everything. You know how it is. Ellie frowned, turning the words over in her mind. Lila sounded strained, her usual confidence replaced by something fragile. Well, you're always welcome here, she said gently. I'll make sure your room's ready. They chatted for a few more minutes before hanging up, but Ellie remained seated by the phone, staring into the darkening yard. Between the mysterious holes in the garden and Lila's unexpected announcement, the day had taken on an unsettling edge. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ellie couldn't shake the sense that something significant, and perhaps unsettling, was about to unfold. And deep down, she wondered if she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Ellie's sleep was restless that night, plagued by dreams that felt more like memories. In the haze of her subconscious, she found herself standing in the garden under a pale silver moon. Arthur was there, just as vivid and alive as he'd been before illness claimed him. He wore his favorite tweed jacket, patched at the elbows from years of wear, and leaned casually against the fence post as though nothing had changed. Arthur? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out but hesitated, afraid he might vanish if she touched him. He didn't look at her directly. Instead, his gaze wandered over the rows of flowers and vegetables they'd planted together. What we buried stays buried, he murmured cryptically, his tone low and urgent. The words sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't understand their meaning. Before she could ask what he meant, the dream shifted. The tranquil garden dissolved into chaos. Shadows crept along the ground, twisting unnaturally, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive silence. Arthur's figure faded into the darkness, leaving Ellie alone amidst the encroaching gloom. She woke suddenly, gasping for breath, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the bedside table. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the familiar contours of her bedroom. Yet, despite knowing she was safe in her own home, Ellie couldn't shake the chill that clung to her skin or the echo of Arthur's warning in her mind. Lila arrived mid-morning, her car pulling up the gravel driveway with a crunch. Ellie stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the crisp autumn air. Her daughter emerged from the vehicle looking tired yet determined, dragging a suitcase behind her. Dark circles shadowed Lila's eyes, and her usual confident posture seemed diminished somehow. "Mom," Lila called, forcing a smile as she approached. Ellie opened her arms wide, embracing her tightly. "It's so good to see you, sweetheart." They held each other for a moment longer than usual, as though both were reluctant to let go. When they finally pulled apart, Ellie noticed the guilt etched into Lila's expression. It wasn't new, she'd seen it often during the difficult months following Arthur's diagnosis, but this time it felt heavier, more pronounced. "I'm glad you're here," Ellie said softly. "Come inside. I made some tea." As they settled into the cozy living room, steam rising from their mugs, polite conversation filled the space between them. But beneath the surface, old wounds lingered. Lila had always struggled with balancing her life, a demanding job, 2 young boys, and a husband who traveled frequently. During Arthur's illness, her visits had been sporadic at best, leaving Ellie to shoulder much of the burden alone. "I'm sorry I haven't been around more," Lila blurted suddenly, setting her mug down with a clink. "I know I wasn't there when Dad got sick, or after he passed, and I hate that." Ellie reached across the coffee table to take her hand. "You don't need to apologize, Lila. You had your own family to take care of. Your father understood that." "But you needed me too," Lila insisted, her voice cracking. "And I wasn't here for you." The raw emotion in her daughter's confession caught Ellie off guard. She squeezed Lila's hand gently, searching for the right words. "We can't change the past, sweetheart. What matters is that you're here now." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken regrets hanging heavily between them. Then Lila cleared her throat and changed the subject, asking about the garden. The tension eased slightly, but Ellie knew their unresolved feelings would resurface sooner or later. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of day that seemed to press down on the world with a damp heaviness. Ellie woke early, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her since Arthur's cryptic warning in her dream. Padding downstairs in her robe, she poured herself a cup of coffee and stepped outside to check on the garden. Her stomach sank when she saw it. More holes had appeared overnight, deeper and more defined than before. This time, they weren't scattered randomly. They formed a straight line leading directly toward the old shed at the edge of the property. The sight sent a jolt of alarm through her. The shed hadn't been opened in years, not since Arthur's final days. Its weathered wooden walls leaned precariously, its padlock rusted shut. "What is going on?" Ellie muttered under her breath, clutching her coffee mug tightly. Lila joined her a few minutes later, yawning and still in her pajamas. "Morning, Mom. What are you—" "Oh." She stopped short when she saw the holes. "What happened here?" "I don't know," Ellie admitted, shaking her head. "It started a few days ago. Harold thinks it's animals, but—" She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the unnatural pattern. Lila frowned, stepping closer to examine the holes. "These aren't random. Someone, or something, is trying to lead us somewhere." "To the shed?" Ellie asked, glancing nervously at the dilapidated structure. Lila followed her gaze, her brow furrowing. "Maybe. Do you think someone broke in? Or maybe it's kids messing with you?" Ellie shook her head. "I don't think so. There's no sign of forced entry anywhere else on the property. And why would anyone target the shed?" A tense silence fell between them as they stared at the ominous trail stretching across the yard. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the strange occurrences weren't going to stop on their own. Something, or someone, wanted them to investigate the shed. Ellie tightened her grip on her coffee mug, steeling herself. "We should take a look," she said finally, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling in her chest. Lila nodded, though her expression mirrored Ellie's apprehension. Together, mother and daughter began walking toward the shed, each step bringing them closer to answers, and perhaps truths better left undisturbed. The shed loomed ahead, its warped wooden planks darkened by decades of weathering. The air around it seemed heavier somehow, as if the structure itself exuded an aura of unease. Ellie hesitated at the threshold, her fingers brushing against the rusted padlock that barred entry. Lila stood a few paces behind her, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Are you sure about this?" Lila asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "What if—" "I don't know. What if something's in there? Something we shouldn't see?" Ellie turned to face her daughter, her expression resolute despite the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "If someone or something is trying to get our attention, ignoring it won't make it go away. Besides," she added wryly, "since when have you been afraid of a little mystery?" Lila opened her mouth to protest but stopped short, sighing instead. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." They both knew they wouldn't leave without answers. Ellie knelt down to inspect the lock more closely, running her fingers over its corroded surface. "I haven't seen this open since your father was alive," she murmured. "He always kept the key somewhere safe, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I can't remember where." Before either of them could decide on their next move, Harold appeared at the edge of the yard, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. His usual gruff demeanor was replaced by an uncharacteristic solemnity. "You shouldn't mess with that shed," he said bluntly, his voice carrying a note of warning. Ellie straightened up, frowning. "Why not? Do you know something, Harold?" He hesitated, glancing toward the shed with visible discomfort. "Some things are better left buried, Ellie. Trust me." His cryptic response only deepened the mystery, and Ellie felt her resolve harden. Whatever secrets lay hidden inside that shed, she was determined to uncover them. "Thank you for your concern, Harold, but I need to know what's going on here." Harold sighed, shaking his head as though resigning himself to her stubbornness. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Ellie and Lila alone once again. Back inside the Victorian home later that afternoon, Lila busied herself unpacking her suitcase in the guest room. The tension from earlier had begun to ease, replaced by a restless curiosity that gnawed at both women. As she folded clothes and arranged toiletries, Lila noticed something tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the bed, a dusty photo album, its leather cover cracked with age. Curious, she pulled it out and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with familiar images. Ellie and Arthur smiling beside the garden, family gatherings under strings of twinkling lights, snapshots of holidays long past. But then she came across a section where several pages had been torn out entirely, leaving jagged edges behind. And beyond those missing pieces, she found photographs that made her pause. One image in particular caught her eye. A faded black and white photo of Arthur standing beside a woman neither Ellie nor Lila recognized. They were posed together in front of a lake, sunlight dancing on the water behind them. Beneath the photo, written in careful cursive, was a caption, "Arthur Margaret, summer 1958. Lila stared at the name, her pulse quickening. Who was Margaret? Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned her? And why had these pages been deliberately removed? She carried the album downstairs to find Ellie sitting in the living room, staring absently into the fireplace. The remnants of their earlier conversation still hung in the air, though the silence between them now felt softer, less strained. "Mom," Lila began cautiously, holding up the album. "Did you know about this?" Ellie looked up startled, then froze when she saw the photograph. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Finally, she reached out and took the album from Lila's hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the edges of the picture. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought he'd gotten rid of all of these." "Who is she?" Lila asked gently, though her tone betrayed her growing unease. "Why does Dad have pictures of her? And why did you tear out the other pages?" Ellie closed the album slowly, clutching it to her chest as though shielding its contents from view. For a long moment, she sat in silence, her gaze distant, lost in memories Lila couldn't begin to fathom. "Margaret was..." Ellie paused, searching for the right words. "She was someone I tried very hard to forget. Someone Arthur loved before he met me." The revelation hit Lila like a punch to the gut. She sank onto the couch beside her mother, stunned. "You never told me about her." "How could I?" Ellie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't my story to tell. Arthur promised me he'd let her go, that part of his life was over. But sometimes," she hesitated, swallowing hard, "sometimes I wondered if he truly meant it." Lila watched her mother carefully, seeing the pain etched into every line of her face. "Do you think whatever's happening now, these holes, the shed, it has something to do with her?" Ellie shook her head, though uncertainty clouded her eyes. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the weight of the past settled heavily over the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed ominously, as if urging them to act. Whatever secrets lay buried in the shed, and in Arthur's history, they were no longer content to stay hidden. The attic was a forgotten world, dusty and dimly lit by the weak afternoon light filtering through the small round window. Boxes stacked haphazardly along the walls held decades of memories, old Christmas ornaments, yellowed books, and faded linens, all relics of a life long past. Lila had ventured up there on a whim, driven by an insatiable need to uncover more about Margaret. Something in her gut told her that the answers they sought weren't confined to the shed alone. Kneeling amidst the clutter, she opened a battered cardboard box labeled simply, "Arthur's Things." Inside, beneath layers of brittle newspaper and moth-eaten sweaters, she found a bundle of letters tied together with a fraying ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant yet hurried, each one addressed to Arthur in ink that had faded slightly with time. Lila's breath caught as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. "My dearest Arthur, I can't stop thinking about you. The way your laugh fills the room, the warmth of your hand in mine. But I fear this happiness is fleeting. There are shadows gathering, ones I don't dare name. Please promise me you'll be careful." Lila skimmed through several more letters, each one filled with Margaret's love for Arthur, her longing for their stolen moments together, and an undercurrent of fear that grew stronger with every word. By the time she reached the final letter, her hands were trembling. "If anything happens to me, look to the stars. You'll find what you seek there. Trust no one, not even those who claim to protect us." "What did you find?" Ellie's voice startled Lila, and she turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow from the hallway below. Wordlessly, Lila handed over the letters. Ellie sank onto a nearby trunk, her eyes scanning the pages with growing unease. When she finished, she set them down gently, her expression unreadable. "I knew about Margaret," Ellie admitted quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "Arthur told me he loved her before we met, but he swore she left town suddenly. He said she vanished without a trace, and he never heard from her again." "But do you believe him?" Lila asked, her tone sharp with suspicion. "These letters suggest something else entirely. She was scared, Mom. Scared enough to warn him, and maybe herself, about danger." Ellie hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the last letter. "I always believed Arthur when he said she was gone. But now," she trailed off, her gaze distant. "Now I wonder if he knew more than he let on. If there's more to why she disappeared." They brought the letters downstairs, spreading them across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. As they pored over the words again, trying to decipher their meaning, Harold appeared unexpectedly at the back door. His face darkened the moment he saw the scattered papers. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rough with anger. "You shouldn't be messing with that." Ellie stood up, meeting his glare head on. "Harold, what do you know? Why are you so determined to keep us from looking into this?" He clenched his jaw, visibly struggling with whether to speak or stay silent. Finally, he sighed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "It's not my place to say. That's all I'll tell you." "It's not your place," Lila interjected, her frustration boiling over. "This is my family's history, my grandfather's secrets. If you know something, you owe it to us to explain." Harold shook his head, his expression grim. "You're playing with fire, both of you. Some things are buried for a reason. Leave it alone before you dig up something you can't handle." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the house in tense silence. Ellie sank back into her chair, rubbing her temples as though warding off a headache. "He knows something," Lila said firmly, "and whatever it is, it's connected to Margaret." Ellie nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Look to the stars," she murmured, repeating Margaret's cryptic phrase. "What could that mean?" Lila frowned thoughtfully. "Maybe it's literal. Maybe it's a clue pointing to something specific. A map, a constellation, or even coordinates." Ellie glanced toward the window, where twilight was beginning to settle over the yard. The garden lay quiet, but the line of holes leading to the shed seemed almost accusatory, urging them forward. "We've come this far," Ellie said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "We have to keep going. For Arthur, for Margaret, and for ourselves." As night fell, the house grew still, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint promise of revelation, or perhaps warning. Whatever truths awaited them in the shed, they were closer than ever to unraveling the tangled threads of the past. The days that followed were a blur of restless activity. Each morning brought new holes, their appearance growing bolder and more deliberate. Ellie began documenting them meticulously, sketching their positions on a large sheet of graph paper she'd retrieved from Arthur's old desk. At first glance, the patterns seemed random, scattered across the garden like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. But as she stepped back to study her work, something extraordinary emerged. It wasn't until Lila joined her late one afternoon that the truth clicked into place. They stood side by side in the kitchen, the map spread out before them, while sunlight streamed through the window and cast golden streaks across the table. "Wait," Lila said suddenly, pointing at the markings. "These aren't just random lines. They're shapes. Look." She traced her finger along the dots, connecting them with invisible lines. "This one looks like Orion, and this—" She paused, squinting. "Is that Cassiopeia?" Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She fetched an astronomy guidebook from the living room, a relic of Arthur's brief fascination with stargazing, and compared the constellations to the pattern on the map. Her heart raced as realization dawned. The holes corresponded perfectly to the stars visible in the autumn sky. "Margaret loved astronomy," Ellie whispered, flipping through the pages of the guidebook. "Arthur mentioned it once, years ago. He said she used to drag him out to the lake at night to watch meteor showers. I never thought much of it then, but now—" "She left clues," Lila finished for her, her voice tinged with awe. "She must have known someone might come looking someday." The revelation sent a shiver down Ellie's spine. Margaret hadn't simply vanished. She had left behind a trail written in the language of the heavens, trusting that someone would decipher it. But who and why? That night, sleep eluded Ellie. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past week replayed in her mind. The letters, the constellations, Harold's cryptic warnings, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. Yet the final picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Around midnight, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts any longer, Ellie slipped out of bed and padded downstairs. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped outside into the cool embrace of the October night. The garden was bathed in moonlight, its shadows long and sharp against the ground. Ellie wandered among the holes, her footsteps soft on the damp grass. Something glinted near one of the newer excavations, a flash of metal half buried in the soil. Kneeling down, she brushed away the dirt to reveal a brass key, tarnished with age but unmistakably real. Her pulse quickened as she turned it over in her hand. It was small, yet sturdy, its teeth worn smooth from use. A single word was engraved on its surface: stars. Without hesitation, Ellie hurried toward the shed, her heart pounding in anticipation. The structure loomed ahead, darker and more foreboding than ever under the pale light of the moon. She inserted the key into the rusted padlock, bracing herself for resistance. To her surprise, it turned smoothly, releasing with a soft click. The door creaked open on protesting hinges, revealing a space thick with dust and shadow. Inside, tools hung forgotten on pegboards, and cobwebs draped the corners like ghostly veils. But it was what rested in the center of the room that drew Ellie's gaze. An old wooden chest, its lid adorned with intricate carvings of celestial patterns. She approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Nestled within layers of yellowed fabric was a collection of items clearly meant to preserve Margaret's legacy. A journal bound in cracked leather, a star chart marked with handwritten notes, and a delicate locket containing a faded photograph of Arthur and Margaret smiling together. Beneath these treasures lay another object wrapped carefully in cloth, a telescope, compact yet finely crafted, its lens gleaming faintly in the dim light. As Ellie sifted through the contents, tears welled in her eyes. Margaret hadn't disappeared without a trace after all. She had left behind fragments of herself, hidden away in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover her story. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. What danger had driven Margaret to hide these things? And how did Arthur fit into it all? Standing there amidst the relics of the past, Ellie felt the weight of history pressing down on her. Somewhere beyond the stars, and perhaps buried deeper still, in the secrets of the Whittaker family, lay the truth. And Ellie knew she couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to unraveling the mystery of Margaret's fate. The air was thick with tension as Ellie, Lila, and Harold stood clustered around the open doorway of the shed. The moonlight streaming in cast long shadows over the cluttered interior, making it feel like a scene pulled straight from one of Ellie's old mystery novels. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply stared at the chest and its contents, each item seeming to hum with secrets waiting to be uncovered. Ellie reached in first, her hands steadied despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She unwrapped the objects one by one, laying them out on the floor like artifacts in an archaeological dig. First came the child's toy soldier, its paint chipped but still recognizable, a relic from another time. Next was the tarnished locket, which she opened carefully to reveal a faded photograph of Margaret smiling softly, her eyes bright with life. Then came the bundle of yellow love letters, tied with a brittle ribbon that crumbled at her touch. Each envelope bore Margaret's name in elegant handwriting. But it was the final object that sent a shiver through all three of them, a tiny coffin-shaped box, intricately carved with stars and moons. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, yet its presence felt monumental, almost sinister. "What is this?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves outside. "I don't know," Ellie admitted, turning the box over in her hands, "but I think we're about to find out." Harold shifted uncomfortably behind them, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You shouldn't have opened this place," he muttered again, though there was less conviction in his voice now. Instead, he sounded resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. Ellie turned to him sharply. "Harold, you've known something all along. Tell us, who does this belong to? Why did Arthur keep it hidden?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with regret. "Arthur, he always suspected foul play when Margaret disappeared. He never said it outright, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought someone wanted her gone, permanently." Lila gasped, clutching the edge of the workbench beside her. "Foul play? You mean murder?" Harold nodded grimly. He didn't have proof, though, just suspicions, and after a while he stopped talking about it altogether, said it wasn't worth stirring up trouble if he couldn't change what happened. Ellie sank back onto her heels, her mind racing. All these years she'd believed Margaret had simply walked away, leaving Arthur heartbroken but alive. But now, faced with the evidence before them, she wondered how much of the truth Arthur had kept buried, not just from her, but from himself. "And the things in here?" Lila asked, gesturing toward the items scattered across the floor. "Do they mean anything to you?" Harold shook his head slowly. "Not directly, but Margaret's name keeps showing up for a reason. Whatever's in that little box," he nodded toward the coffin-shaped artifact in Ellie's hands. "It's connected to her, and maybe to why she vanished." The weight of Harold's revelation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Ellie stared down at the tiny box, her fingers tracing its carvings. The stars and moons seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light, almost as if they were alive. She glanced at Lila, whose face mirrored her own mix of fear and determination. "We need to open it," Ellie said firmly, breaking the silence. "Whatever's inside might give us answers." Lila hesitated, biting her lip. "Are you sure? What if it's dangerous?" "It already is," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "We can't walk away now, not when we're so close." Harold sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as though warding off a headache. "Fine, open it, but don't say I didn't warn you." With trembling hands, Ellie lifted the lid of the box. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, brittle with age and a single silver charm shaped like a star. She unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a short message written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. "If you found this, then my fears were true. Trust only the stars. They will guide you to safety." Beneath the note was a set of numbers scrawled hastily, 44° 21N 73° 58W. "A location," Lila breathed, pulling out her phone to search the coordinates. Her brow furrowed as the screen lit up with a map. "It's somewhere near Lake Champlain, a few hours' drive from here." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The lake where Arthur and Margaret used to watch the stars together. The place where their love story began. Now it seemed to hold the key to unraveling the mystery of her disappearance. "Margaret must have left this trail for someone to follow," Ellie murmured, clutching the note tightly. "She wanted us to find her, or at least find out what happened to her." Harold stepped closer, peering over Ellie's shoulder at the map on Lila's phone. His expression darkened. That area is remote. If something bad went down there, nobody would have found it. For a moment, none of them spoke. The implications hung heavy in the air. Whoever had taken Margaret, or whatever fate had befallen her, had done so far from prying eyes. Yet she had fought back in her own way, leaving breadcrumbs for those brave enough to seek the truth. Ellie took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We're going," she declared, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the lake and see where these coordinates lead." Lila nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm coming with you." Harold hesitated, clearly torn between caution and loyalty. Finally, he let out a resigned sigh. "Then I'm driving. Somebody's got to make sure you two don't get yourselves killed." As they packed up the items and secured the shed once more, the night grew quieter, the wind dying down as though holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Lake Champlain waited, its waters reflecting the same stars that had guided Margaret decades ago. And somewhere within its depths or along its shores lay the answers they sought. But as Ellie climbed into bed later that night, sleep eluded her. The image of the tiny coffin-shaped box lingered in her mind, its contents both cryptic and chilling. Whatever awaited them at the lake, one thing was certain. They were about to uncover truths that had been buried for far too long, and some secrets were better left undisturbed. The next morning, Lila set out early for the local library, determined to piece together more of Margaret's story. The small brick building sat nestled between a diner and a hardware store, its sign creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and polish, and rows of dusty shelves stretched toward the high ceiling. Lila approached the librarian, a kindly older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived here decades ago," Lila explained. "Her name was Margaret. Margaret. I don't even know her last name." The librarian raised an eyebrow but nodded knowingly. "Let me guess. You're digging into one of those stories." She shuffled off to retrieve a box of archived newspapers, muttering under her breath about how some secrets never truly stayed buried. Lila spent hours poring over yellowed clippings, her fingers smudging ink as she flipped through pages brittle with age. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for, a series of articles detailing a scandal that had rocked the town nearly 60 years earlier. Margaret's surname turned out to be Hargrove, and she had been entangled with the Calloway family, one of the wealthiest and most influential clans in the region. According to the reports, Margaret worked as a governess for the Calloways during the summer of 1958, the same year Arthur and Margaret posed together by the lake. But her employment ended abruptly when rumors surfaced about an inappropriate relationship between her and James Calloway, the eldest son of the family. The gossip escalated into accusations, and Margaret vanished shortly thereafter, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. One clipping stood out among the rest, a brief editorial questioning whether Margaret might have met foul play. The article hinted at threats made against her by members of the Calloway family, though no evidence ever came to light. The piece concluded with a chilling sentence: "If justice is to be served, it will require courage from those who knew her best." Lila copied down the details meticulously, her heart pounding as the pieces began to fall into place. Whatever danger Margaret faced hadn't come from nowhere. It had roots in power, privilege, and desperation. And if Arthur suspected foul play, he must have believed the Calloways were involved. Back at the house, tension simmered just below the surface. Ellie paced the living room, clutching the photocopies Lila had brought home, while Harold sat stiffly in his usual armchair, avoiding her gaze. When she finally confronted him, her voice trembled with a mix of anger and grief. "How could you keep this from me?" Ellie demanded, waving the papers in his direction. "All these years you knew Arthur thought something terrible happened to Margaret, and you said nothing." Harold sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I promised him, Ellie. He begged me not to tell you because he didn't want you dragged into it. He loved you too much to let that shadow touch your life." "That wasn't your decision to make," she shot back, tears welling in her eyes. "Do you think I wouldn't have wanted to know? Do you think I wouldn't have fought for the truth? It wasn't about fighting, Harold snapped, his own frustration boiling over. It was about protecting you. You'd already lost so much. Your parents, then Arthur's illness. Arthur didn't want you carrying the weight of another tragedy. Ellie sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions rising within her. Grief, betrayal, guilt. They all tangled together until she couldn't separate one from the other. For years, she'd mourned Arthur's death without fully understanding the burdens he carried in life. Now, faced with the reality of his silence, she felt both closer to him and farther away than ever before. You should have told me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Even if it hurt, I deserve to know. Harold looked away, shame etched into every line of his face. Maybe you're right, but hindsight doesn't change what's done. All we can do now is move forward and hope we're ready for whatever we find. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the house shifted from tension to quiet determination. Lila spread out the research materials on the dining table, organizing them into a timeline. Ellie joined her tears drying as focus replaced emotion. Together they mapped out connections between Margaret, the Callaways, and Arthur, piecing together a narrative that spanned decades. What's clear is that Margaret wasn't just some random woman Arthur fell in love with, Lila said, tapping a finger on the editorial clipping. She was caught in something bigger than herself, something dangerous. And Arthur tried to protect her memory, Ellie added softly. But why hide everything in the shed? Why leave clues instead of telling me outright? Maybe he thought you'd figure it out eventually, Lila suggested. Or maybe he hoped someone else would finish what he started. Their conversation paused as Harold reappeared, holding a thermos of coffee. He set it down on the table without a word, his apology unspoken but evident in his actions. Ellie gave him a small nod, acknowledging the olive branch. By nightfall, the puzzle seemed less fragmented and more like a mosaic waiting to be completed. They still didn't have all the answers, but they knew enough to understand the stakes. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but none of them doubted its necessity. As Ellie tucked herself into bed later that evening, she stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Margaret's disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was part of a larger web of secrets and lies. And somewhere along Lake Champlain, the threads converged, leading to truths that might finally bring peace, or shatter everything they thought they knew. Whatever awaited them, Ellie was certain of one thing. The past refused to stay buried, and neither would she. That night, Ellie's dreams returned with an intensity that left her breathless. She found herself back in the garden, but this time it wasn't her tending to the plants. It was Arthur. He knelt in the dirt, his hands trembling, as he dug into the soil with a small spade. The moon hung low and full above him, casting its silvery light over his hunched form. His face was streaked with tears, each one glistening like dew on his cheeks. "Arthur!" Ellie called out, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. He didn't respond, too consumed by his task. As she drew closer, she noticed something clutched in his other hand, a locket identical to the one they'd found in the shed. Its chain dangled loosely between his fingers, catching the moonlight as if trying to speak for itself. Ellie reached out, desperate to touch him, but her hand passed through his shoulder as though he were made of smoke. She watched helplessly as he continued digging, his movements frantic yet deliberate. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the locket inside and began covering it with earth, patting the ground gently as if saying goodbye. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save you." The dream shifted then, dissolving into fragments of memory. Margaret laughing under a starlit sky, Arthur holding her close at the lake, their faces glowing with love and hope. But beneath the beauty lurked shadows, whispers of threats, hurried goodbyes, and eyes watching from the darkness. Ellie woke with a start, her heart pounding and her sheets damp with sweat. Yet despite the unsettling nature of the dream, she felt strangely connected to Arthur, not just as her husband, but as a man burdened by secrets and regrets. It was as if he had reached across time to remind her of what mattered most, uncovering the truth no matter how painful. The next evening, Ellie and Lila sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner of soup and bread. Harold had gone home hours earlier, leaving mother and daughter alone with their thoughts. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ellie stirred her spoon absently, staring into the steam rising from her bowl. "Your grandfather, he wasn't always the strong, steady man, you remember," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Margaret's disappearance broke something in him. Something I don't think ever fully healed." Lila looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in her mother's tone. "You never talked about this before. Did he really believe something bad happened to her?" Ellie nodded, setting her spoon down. "Yes, but not right away. At first he convinced himself she'd left because she didn't love him anymore. That hurt him deeply, but it was easier to accept than the alternative. Over time, though, little things started adding up. The way people avoided talking about her, the rumors Harold mentioned, even the guilt he carried for not being able to protect her." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window where twilight painted the yard in shades of indigo. "There were nights when I'd wake up and find him sitting outside, staring at the stars. He used to mutter to himself, asking why he hadn't seen the signs sooner, why he hadn't done more to keep her safe." Lila listened intently, her chest tightening with empathy. Growing up, she'd always seen Arthur as a distant figure, a kind but reserved man who existed mostly in photographs and fleeting visits. Hearing him described this way, as flawed, vulnerable, and deeply human, changed everything. "He must have loved her so much," Lila murmured, her voice tinged with awe. "To carry that kind of pain for so long." "He did," Ellie confirmed, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "But he also loved me, and I think part of him hoped that by moving forward, with us, he could leave the past behind. Only the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it?" Lila nodded, thinking of the constellations etched into the tiny coffin-shaped box, the coordinates leading to Lake Champlain, and the haunting words scrawled in Margaret's handwriting. "Do you think he regretted keeping all of this from you?" Ellie sighed, considering the question carefully. "Not entirely. I think he believed he was protecting me, but now," she trailed off, shaking her head, "now I realize that protecting someone isn't the same as shielding them from the truth. Sometimes knowing, even if it hurts, is better than living in ignorance." They finished their meal in companionable silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. For the first time in years, Ellie allowed herself to grieve not just for Arthur's loss, but for the pieces of him she'd never truly known. And for Lila, the image of her grandfather transformed from a distant memory into a man shaped by love, loss, and the unyielding pull of the past. As they cleared the dishes, Lila glanced at the map still spread out on the counter, the coordinates circled in red ink. "We'll find her, Mom," she said firmly, her resolve unwavering. "We'll find Margaret, and we'll make sure her story is told." Ellie met her daughter's gaze, gratitude and determination shining in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady, "for Arthur, for Margaret, and for ourselves." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of answers waiting just beyond the horizon. Whatever truths lay hidden along the shores of Lake Champlain, they were drawing nearer with every passing moment. And though the journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, neither woman doubted its necessity or its inevitability. The morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something significant to happen. Ellie and Lila stood side by side in the garden, their shovels resting against the dewy grass as they studied the patch of earth before them. It was a small area near the rose bushes, undisturbed by the mysterious holes that had appeared over the past weeks. According to the constellation map and Margaret's cryptic clues, this was the final point, the place where the stars aligned. Ellie knelt down, brushing away a few stray leaves with her gloved hands. "This is it," she said softly, more to herself than to Lila. Her voice carried a mix of anticipation and trepidation, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Lila nodded, gripping her shovel tightly. "Let's do it." They began digging together, their movements synchronized despite the tension humming in the air. The soil was cool and damp beneath their tools, yielding easily at first but growing firmer as they went deeper. Each thrust of the shovel felt like peeling back another layer of time, bringing them closer to answers buried not just in the ground, but in decades-old secrets. Harold lingered nearby, leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as though bracing himself for what was to come. He didn't offer to help, nor did he try to stop them. Instead, he watched silently, wringing his hands in a gesture that betrayed his unease. "You don't have to stay, Harold," Ellie called out without looking up. Her tone was gentle but firm, acknowledging his presence without inviting interference. "I know," he replied gruffly, his voice barely audible, "but I can't leave either." Lila glanced at him briefly, noting the guilt etched into every line of his face. Whatever he knew or feared, it weighed heavily on him. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but now wasn't the time. They were too close to uncovering the truth. The digging grew harder as they reached a depth of about 2 feet. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mingling with the crispness of fallen leaves. Then, suddenly, Ellie's shovel struck something solid. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Lila asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Ellie dropped to her knees, brushing away the loose dirt with her hands. Beneath the surface lay a wooden box, its edges worn smooth by time. It was smaller than the one they'd found in the shed, but its significance was undeniable. With trembling fingers, she pried it open, revealing its contents: a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a silver pocket watch engraved with Margaret's initials, and a folded piece of paper that looked startlingly familiar. Ellie unfolded the paper carefully, recognizing Margaret's handwriting immediately. This note was shorter than the others, almost frantic in its brevity. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone. Trust no one, not even those who claim to love you. The Callaways will stop at nothing to protect their name. Find justice for me." Lila read the words over her mother's shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. "Justice? What does she mean?" Ellie shook her head, her mind racing. She must have known she was in danger. That's why she left these clues, for someone to follow after her. Harold stepped closer, his expression grim. "You should stop here," he said quietly, though there was no conviction in his voice. "Some truths aren't worth unearthing." Ellie ignored him, rifling through the bundle of letters. Each one detailed Margaret's growing fear, her suspicions about the Callaway family, her attempts to distance herself from James, and her desperate hope that Arthur would believe her if anything happened to her. One letter stood out among the rest. In it, Margaret described overhearing a conversation between James and his father, discussing plans to silence her permanently. She wrote of feeling trapped, unable to escape the web of lies and threats that surrounded her. Yet even in her despair, she clung to hope, vowing to leave evidence behind so that someone might one day expose the truth. "This isn't just about Margaret anymore," Ellie murmured, clutching the letters to her chest. "It's about power, about silencing anyone who dares threaten their reputation." Lila stared at her mother, realization dawning in her eyes. That's why they made her disappear, and why Arthur suspected foul play all along. Harold let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as though warding off a headache. "I warned him not to dig too deep," he admitted finally, his voice thick with regret. "But Arthur, he couldn't let it go. Not completely." Ellie turned to him sharply, her gaze piercing. "And you kept quiet. All these years you let me live in ignorance while Arthur carried this burden alone?" "It wasn't my place to tell you," Harold shot back, his frustration boiling over. "He trusted me to keep his secret, to protect you from the ugliness of it all." "Well, it's out now," Ellie replied firmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "And we're going to finish what he started." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, Ellie and Lila packed up the items they'd uncovered. The wooden box, the letters, the pocket watch, all of it would serve as proof of Margaret's story. They still didn't know exactly what awaited them at Lake Champlain, but they were certain of one thing. The Calloway family's secrets were tied to her disappearance, and exposing the truth was the only way to honor her memory. Harold lingered a moment longer, watching as they prepared to leave. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful, both of you. The past doesn't forgive easily." Ellie met his gaze, gratitude and resolve shining in her eyes. "Neither do we." With that, mother and daughter turned toward the house, their steps resolute. The journey ahead promised danger and uncertainty, but neither woman doubted its necessity. For Margaret, for Arthur, and for themselves, they would see it through to the end, even if it meant confronting forces far greater than they could imagine. The silence in the garden was profound, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth. Ellie and Lila worked with renewed urgency, their movements deliberate as they dug deeper into the final hole. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, illuminating flecks of gold in the damp soil. Each thrust of the shovel felt like unraveling another thread of a decades-old mystery, pulling them closer to answers that had been buried, literally and figuratively, for far too long. Then, with a soft thud, Ellie's shovel struck something metallic. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Dropping to her knees, she brushed away the dirt with trembling hands, revealing a small, rusted tin half buried beneath layers of earth. Its surface bore faint scratches, evidence of hurried concealment, but it remained intact despite the passage of time. Lila crouched beside her, her own hands hovering hesitantly over the object. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice carried an unspoken understanding that this discovery would change everything. Ellie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the tin carefully, her fingers brushing aside traces of soil that clung stubbornly to its edges. Inside lay two items, a delicate gold wedding band engraved with tiny stars, and a folded slip of paper yellowed with age. Her heart clenched painfully as she recognized Arthur's handwriting on the note before she even unfolded it. "Forgive me," it read. "I couldn't let you go." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she stared at the words, their weight settling heavily in her chest. Beside her, Lila reached out to examine the ring, turning it over in her palm. The engraving inside confirmed what they already suspected. "To Margaret, my guiding star." "He kept her ring," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "He never stopped loving her." Ellie nodded, clutching the note tightly in her hand. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the enormity of the discovery pressing down on them. This wasn't just a keepsake, it was proof of Arthur's enduring grief, his inability to move on from the woman who had vanished so tragically from his life. And now it seemed clear why he'd hidden these things in the shed, leaving behind clues for someone to follow. Harold approached cautiously, drawn by the sudden stillness that had fallen over the garden. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, as he gazed down at the tin and its contents. When Ellie looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears, he sighed deeply, knowing there was no point in denying the truth any longer. "She didn't leave willingly, did she?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible above the wind rustling through the trees. Harold shook his head, slowly, guilt etched into every line of his weathered face. "No," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Arthur always believed she was taken, from him, from everyone. He searched for years, trying to find where they might have hidden her." The implication hung in the air, stark and unyielding. Margaret hadn't simply disappeared, she had been murdered. The Calloways, or someone acting on their behalf, had silenced her permanently, ensuring she could never expose their secrets. And Arthur, unable to accept her loss, had spent decades searching for closure, leaving behind fragments of her story in the hope that someone would one day piece it all together. Back inside the house, they spread out the items once more, examining them with fresh eyes. The child's toy soldier, the tarnished locket, the bundle of love letters, the tiny coffin-shaped box. All of it suddenly made sense. These weren't random objects. They belonged to people connected to Margaret's life, and possibly her death. Each item was a breadcrumb leading back to her, a way for Arthur to honor her memory while grappling with the pain of her absence. The Callaways, Lila said finally, breaking the heavy silence. They must have orchestrated it. That's why she warned us not to trust anyone, not even those who claimed to love her. Ellie nodded, her mind racing as she pieced together the timeline. She tried to distance herself from them, but they wouldn't let her escape, and when she threatened to reveal the truth, her voice trailed off, the unspeakable conclusion hanging between them. They killed her, Lila finished softly, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. And Arthur knew, or at least suspected, but he couldn't prove it. So he buried her ring here, along with his guilt and his love, hoping someday someone would uncover the truth. Harold sank into a nearby chair, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the revelation. He carried that burden alone, he murmured, shaking his head. All those nights I saw him digging in the garden, muttering to himself. I thought he was losing his mind, but he was searching for her, for justice. Ellie closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of Arthur's sorrow. She had known him as a kind, steady man, devoted to his family and his garden. But beneath that exterior had lain a well of unresolved grief. A man haunted by the woman he loved and lost, and by the knowledge that he hadn't been able to save her. We owe it to him, and to Margaret, to finish what he started, Ellie said firmly, her voice cutting through the somber atmosphere. Whatever lies waiting for us at Lake Champlain, we'll find it. We'll make sure her story is told. Lila nodded, determination hardening her features. If the Callaways are responsible, then the world needs to know. No matter how much power they think they have, they can't erase the past forever. As they prepared for the journey ahead, the house felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Outside, the wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the porch and rattling the windows. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Lake Champlain beckoned, its waters dark and mysterious, hiding secrets within its depths. Ellie glanced at the ring resting on the table, its golden surface gleaming faintly in the fading light. Margaret's star had guided them this far, leading them toward truths long concealed. Now it was up to them to ensure her light would shine again, even if it meant confronting forces that thrived in shadow. For Arthur, for Margaret, and for justice long denied. The days that followed were quiet yet transformative, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. Ellie found herself lingering in the garden more often, her hands brushing against the petals of marigolds and roses as she reflected on all they had uncovered. The truth about Margaret's fate was devastating, but it also brought a strange sense of peace, a clarity that had eluded her for decades. For the first time, she could see Arthur not just as her husband, but as a man who had loved deeply and grieved profoundly. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Ellie stood alone by the final hole they had dug. The tin containing Margaret's ring and Arthur's note rested on the kitchen table inside, but their presence lingered here, in the soil, in the stars above, in the memories now laid bare. She knelt down, pressing her palm against the freshly turned earth, and whispered softly, "I forgive you, Arthur." Her voice trembled with emotion, but there was no bitterness in her words, only understanding. He had carried the burden of Margaret's loss alone because he believed it was his duty to shield her from pain. And while his silence had once felt like betrayal, she now saw it for what it truly was, an act of love, flawed though it may have been. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of release rather than sorrow. "You did your best," she continued, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "And now we'll do ours." Later that night, Lila joined her mother in the living room, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth. They sat side by side on the couch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, their shared exhaustion giving way to a fragile sort of calm. "I'm sorry, Mom," Lila said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her tone was earnest, tinged with regret. "For everything, for not being here when Dad got sick, for letting distance come between us." I should have done better. Ellie reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. We both made mistakes, sweetheart. But apologies don't change the past. They open doors to the future. What matters is that we're here now, together. Lila nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I want to stay connected this time. No more letting life get in the way. Ellie smiled, squeezing her hand gently. That sounds like a promise worth keeping. The next morning they returned to the garden with arms full of flowers, daisies, lilies, and bluebells, each chosen for its symbolism of remembrance and renewal. Together they planted them over the final hole, transforming the space into a living memorial for Margaret. As they worked, the air seemed lighter, filled with the faint hum of bees and the occasional chirp of birdsong. This feels right, Lila said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. The blooms added splashes of color to the autumn landscape, their vibrant hues standing in stark contrast to the muted tones of fallen leaves. It does, Ellie agreed, brushing dirt from her gloves. Margaret deserves to be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who loved deeply and fought bravely, even when the odds were against her. They placed a small plaque at the center of the flower bed, engraved with Margaret's name and a single line, "Guided by the stars, remembered in our hearts." It was simple yet profound, capturing the essence of the woman whose story had brought them closer together. As they stood side by side, surveying their work, Harold appeared at the edge of the yard. His usual gruff demeanor was softened by an expression of quiet respect. Without a word, he approached and handed Ellie a bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered from his own garden. "These are for her," he said gruffly, nodding toward the memorial. "She deserves them." Ellie accepted the flowers with a grateful smile, placing them carefully among the newly planted blooms. "Thank you, Harold. That means a lot." He hesitated, glancing at the plaque before meeting Ellie's gaze. "Arthur would have been proud of you. Both of you." His words hung in the air, carrying a weight that needed no further explanation. For all the secrets and regrets that had shaped their lives, they had found a way to honor the past without letting it define them. The garden, once a place of solace for Ellie, had become something more, a testament to love, loss, and the resilience of those left behind. That night, as Ellie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt a sense of resolution she hadn't known in years. The journey to uncover Margaret's story had been painful, but it had also been healing. Through it, she had rediscovered pieces of Arthur she thought she'd lost forever, and forged a deeper bond with Lila that promised to endure. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and blossoms. Above, the stars shone brightly in the clear October sky, their light guiding her thoughts toward hope rather than despair. Margaret's star had led them home, not just to answers, but to each other, and in that moment, Ellie knew they would carry her memory forward, ensuring her light would never fade. Months had passed since the discovery in the garden, and the rhythms of life had begun to settle into a quieter, gentler pace. The once overwhelming weight of secrets and unanswered questions had softened, replaced by a bittersweet acceptance that some mysteries were never meant to be fully unraveled. Ellie sat on the porch now, wrapped in a quilt against the crisp autumn air, as the sun dipped low on the horizon. Its golden light bathed the garden in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the flowers they had planted in Margaret's memory. Though the truth of Margaret's death remained elusive, Ellie no longer felt consumed by the need for answers. What mattered most was the journey they had taken together, the way it had brought her closer to Arthur's heart and strengthened the bond with Lila. She understood now that Arthur hadn't kept Margaret's story hidden out of malice or neglect. He had done so out of love, carrying her memory in his own quiet way. And in uncovering those fragments of the past, Ellie had found a measure of peace, not just for herself, but for him as well. The garden stretched before her, alive with color and life. The memorial they had created beneath the stars stood as a testament to Margaret's courage and resilience, a place where her spirit could rest among blooms that swayed gently in the breeze. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense, but it was enough. Enough to honor the woman who had touched Arthur's life so deeply, and enough to remind Ellie that even in loss, there is beauty to be found. As the last rays of sunlight melted into twilight, Ellie rose slowly from her chair, feeling the familiar creak of age in her bones. She lingered a moment longer, gazing out at the horizon, when something caught her eye. A single, perfectly round hole beneath the bench where Arthur used to sit. Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, she wondered if the strange occurrences that had plagued them months ago were beginning anew. But this time there was no unease, only curiosity. Kneeling down carefully, she brushed away the loose soil with trembling fingers, revealing what lay within. Nestled in the earth was a pressed forget-me-not flower, its delicate blue petals still vibrant despite the passage of time. Ellie picked it up gently, cradling it in her palm as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't need to question who or what had left it there. Whether it was Arthur reaching out one final time or Margaret herself leaving a token of gratitude, the message was clear. Ellie smiled softly, clutching the flower to her chest. "I won't," she whispered, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I won't forget." The wind stirred around her, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song, the melody sweet and mournful all at once. As Ellie stepped back inside, she placed the forget-me-not on the windowsill, where it caught the fading light of day. It would remain there, a reminder of the love and loss that had shaped their lives, and of the enduring hope that even in darkness, stars will always guide us home. The house grew quiet as night fell, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and the shadows lengthening across the walls. Outside, the garden stood serene under a canopy of stars, its beauty a testament to the lives intertwined within its soil. For Ellie, Lila, and Harold, the past would always hold its share of sorrow, but it also held moments of grace, connection, and redemption. And as long as they carried those memories with them, Margaret's star would continue to shine brightly, guiding them toward new dawns.